The nanny slept on the floor with the baby. The millionaire saw it. And then what happened? The first winter rain hammered down on Boston, sliding in jagged streams across a fogged window, drawing crooked lines as if searching for a way out. In the damp basement of an aging building, a weak yellow light spilled across the room, casting the shadow of a woman curled up in a rickety wooden chair. Clara Evans, 31, former pastry chef at a small boutique bakery, clutched a sheet of paper with bold black letters. Vacate in 15 days, 3 months overdue. The page trembled in her hands, not from the cold, but from a quiet, creeping fear that seemed to crawl through her veins. She had read the notice for the 10th time, willing the words to change. But they stayed, sharp and merciless. Her light brown hair was matted from the rain on her walk home, clinging to pale cheeks. Her gray-blue eyes sagged under the weight of too many sleepless nights. Just last week, she'd been working at a small bakery on Tremont Street, but the young owner, not bothering to meet her gaze, had simply said, "We need someone faster." It was her third job loss in 6 months. And that sentence, "someone faster," was just a modern echo of what Clara had heard all her life. Not good enough. She knew the feeling too well. At 7, a house fire had taken her parents. Clara woke in a cold iron cot at an orphanage on the edge of the city. No one visited, no one said her name with warmth. The staff weren't cruel, but they were overworked. Clara learned to do everything quietly, folding her clothes, sharing candy with younger kids, swallowing her tears when the lights went out. At 10, she was taken in by the Holloway family. Their house smelled of lemon cleaner, but Mrs. Holloway quickly made it clear. "You'll help with the chores. That's how we teach gratitude." Clara understood immediately. She wasn't their daughter, just free help. 3 other foster families followed, each starting with promises and ending with, "She doesn't quite fit with us." That childhood left her with a hollow that never filled, silent, steady, like a wound that refused to close. And now, staring at the eviction notice, that hollow throbbed like it had never healed. Outside, the rain fell heavier. The drip from the gutter mingled with the tick of the wall clock, each tick like a reminder that time was slipping away and her options were running out. Her basement apartment was barely big enough for an old bed, a small kitchen counter, and a chipped wooden dresser. In the corner under the bed sat a wooden box. Inside, a rolling pin, a few dented baking molds, and a weathered recipe notebook she'd kept since she was 16. Once she'd dreamed of a little bakery where strangers could find warmth in something sweet. But life wasn't a storybook. That dream now lay in the box, buried under bills and fear. Clara let her shoulders drop, releasing a long sigh. Staying here meant waiting to be thrown out. But where could she go? And what could she do? Outside the window, the street lamp's glow cut through the rain, making the room feel even colder. Clara pulled her hands into the sleeves of her thin sweater, her eyes still locked on the eviction notice. One thought whispered through her mind. Maybe. I really don't deserve better. The phone rang, slicing through the damp stillness of the apartment. On the screen flashed the name Isla Ramirez, the only friend Clara had kept in touch with since the chaotic years of her early 20s. "Clara, listen." Isla's voice came fast and warm, as if she were pulling her out of cold water. "I've got news. My next-door boss needs someone to live in, manage the household, and help with the baby. Good pay, room and board included. All you need is to know how to clean and not panic when a kid cries." Clara frowned slightly, part surprise, part skepticism. "I've never been a housekeeper, Isla. When I was younger, I dreamed about opening my own bakery. And now you're telling me to work as live-in help for some stranger." Isla cut her off, firm but kind. "You've survived every hard thing life's thrown at you, Clara. Cleaning a house and holding a baby? That's nothing compared to what you've already been through." Clara stayed quiet. Her eyes drifted toward the small fridge in the corner. Inside, only half a carton of milk, nearly expired. She glanced at her tattered wallet, the seam split open to show its worn lining. Outside, the rain still battered the windows. Wind hissed through the gaps in the frame, making the room seem to shrink. Isla's voice softened. "You don't have to stay in this job forever, but at least it'll give you a roof over your head and a way to start over. You deserve more than sitting here, waiting to be thrown out." Clara took a long breath. Isla's words felt like a thin rope, fragile but strong enough to hold on to. "Send me the address," Clara said at last, her voice quiet but sure. "I'll give it a shot." Isla exhaled in relief. "That's my girl. Pack something warm. Aspen's freezing." When the call ended, Clara sat still for a few more minutes. The room was just as damp, cold, and small as before, but for the first time in months, she felt as if a door had opened somewhere. Not a big one, not blazing with light, but just enough for a single thread of hope to slip through. 2 days later, the last bus wound its way up the twisting mountain road into Aspen. Snow blanketed rows of towering pines, the air thin and cold enough to turn each breath Clara took into a faint cloud. When the bus stopped before a tall iron gate, she stepped down, wheeling her suitcase along the stone path toward a building that looked like it had been lifted from a winter painting. Stonehaven Estate rose with a dark slate roof, silver-gray stone walls, and tall windows draped in deep burgundy curtains. It felt both majestic and distant, as if the place was accustomed to living in silence. The heavy wooden door creaked open. A woman in her early 50s, hair neatly pinned, posture straight, gave Clara a quick once-over. "You must be Clara Evans?" Her voice was low, steady, but not unkind. "Yes, I'm Clara. I'm Mrs. Pennington, the housekeeper here. Mr. Blake is busy with his daughter, so I'll show you to your room first." Inside, the ceiling soared high above, polished wood floors reflecting the light from crystal chandeliers. Abstract paintings lined the hallway, and bookshelves reached all the way to the ceiling. Yet, for all its perfection, the house felt empty. Footsteps swallowed by the thick stillness. No scent of cooking, no echo of laughter. Clara's room was upstairs, its window looking out over a snow-covered forest of pines. The bed was neatly made. A small table stood by the window, but the chill still seeped in through the window frame. "Your off hours end at 8 p.m., Mrs. Pennington said. "You may use the side kitchen and laundry room on the first floor. Baby Ella has a daytime nanny, but at times you'll be asked to help when Mr. Blake or I are busy. And," she paused, "no one enters the library or his study unless invited." Clara nodded. Understood. They were still speaking when the sound of footsteps came from the hall, mingled with the soft babble of a child. Clara turned. A tall man with broad shoulders and neatly combed dark hair appeared at the top of the staircase. In his arms was a baby girl of about 10 months, dressed in a white knit sweater, her wide eyes curious. "You're the new one?" His voice was deep, clipped. "Yes, I'm Clara." "Mrs. Pennington has told you what's expected?" "She has, sir." "I ask only for efficiency and silence." With a small nod, he turned, carrying Ella toward the far end of the hall. Clara stood still, watching him disappear. The baby glanced back at her, eyes curious, one tiny hand gripping her father's shirt. And then they vanished behind a door. The house fell quiet again. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, its low whistle a reminder that this was unlike any place Clara had ever been. The first days passed quietly. Clara stuck to her tasks, dusting, tidying the living room, preparing light snacks in the side kitchen, and occasionally helping Mrs. Pennington if Ella woke early or grew restless. Adrian was rarely home all day. He moved in and out like a man who always had somewhere more important to be. One weekend evening, Clara was folding a blanket in the living room when Mrs. Pennington entered, her expression tense. "Ella's nanny just called. She's running a high fever and can't make it. I need to leave immediately. My sister's been admitted to the hospital. Could you watch Ella tonight?" Clara hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Of course." "Mr. Blake's on his way to the airport. Won't be back until late. She might cry, but usually sleeps after some warm milk," Mrs. Pennington said quickly before hurrying out. An hour later, Ella's cries began. Soft whimpers at first, then quickly building into sharp, aching sobs. Clara tried everything: a clean diaper, a warm bottle, even opening the curtains to show her the snow outside. Nothing worked. She gathered Ella close, settling into the armchair by the fireplace, and whispered, "It's okay, little one. I know this feeling. I used to cry like this too, alone, and no one came." Her voice was low, warm, carrying the weight of memory. Slowly, Ella began to calm, her sobs fading into small sighs. Clara began to hum, a lullaby from her orphanage days. No words, just rhythm, but enough to weave a sense of safety. Ella's eyelids drooped, her breathing steadied. Afraid to wake her, Clara stayed still, pulling a light blanket over them both. That fragile warmth made Clara's own eyelids heavy, and soon she drifted into sleep, Ella still nestled against her chest. Near 11 p.m., Adrian returned. Snow clung to his coat, and his steps were soft so as not to wake the baby. He was used to the quiet when coming home late, but tonight, as he stepped into the living room, he stopped. On the Persian rug before the fireplace, Clara slept, her brown hair loose around her shoulders, cradling Ella in her arms. The baby's face was pressed to her chest, one tiny hand gripping her shirt as if afraid to let go. Adrian froze, not from shock, but from something older, deeper, a feeling he thought he'd long buried. It wasn't just tenderness, it was the ache of realizing this was what home could have been, and how long he'd gone without it. For years, his nights had been filled only with the echo of his own footsteps and cold silence. But this scene broke something open inside him. Clara wasn't just looking after his child, she was holding her as if she held a part of herself. No duty, no paycheck, just genuine care. He didn't wake them. Instead, he stepped forward quietly, switched off the lamp, and fetched an extra blanket, gently laying it over them both. Then he stood there a while longer, listening to the soft breathing of his daughter, mingling with the deeper, steady breaths of the woman he was beginning to realize was no longer just the new one in his home. Since that night, no one spoke of Clara and Ella sleeping by the fireplace, but something had quietly shifted. Adrian remained a man of few words, walking with the steady pace of someone who always knew exactly where he was headed. Yet his gaze lingered a little longer now, when Clara poured Mrs. Pennington's coffee in the morning, when she sat in the corner of the side kitchen, mending a wool sweater, or when she bent down to whisper to Ella while changing her diaper. Clara didn't seem to notice, or if she did, she never said. She continued her work with careful precision, every movement neat, unhurried, yet never slow. One rainy afternoon, Clara was dusting the bookshelves in the library. It was the very room Mrs. Pennington had once said firmly, "No one enters unless invited." But today the door stood open. Adrian was at the shelves, a leather-bound book in his hand. Without looking up, he asked in his low voice, "Do you like reading?" Clara startled slightly before answering, "Yes. At the orphanage, I used to read the books people left behind." "What kind of books?" She hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Romance novels." Adrian looked up, one eyebrow lifting as if the answer surprised him. "Why?" Clara smoothed the edge of the cloth in her hand, her eyes resting on the neat row of spines. "Because in them, the hurt ones, the forgotten ones, they're usually the ones who end up loved the most. No one starts with everything, but they end with what everyone wants: to be seen, to be chosen, and to be loved for exactly who they are. Adrian said nothing. His eyes stayed on her, and for a moment the quiet room seemed to warm. That night, when Clara returned to her room, she found a copy of Jane Eyre laid neatly on her pillow. No note, but she knew exactly who had left it there. The next morning, while Clara was folding towels in the laundry room, Mrs. Pennington appeared. "Mr. Blake would like to see you in his study," she said, her tone as even as always, though there was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. Adrian's study sat at the end of the upstairs hall, a dark wood door that was almost always closed. When Clara stepped inside, she noticed the room felt different from the rest of the house. Soft light poured in through a large window onto a walnut desk. The bookshelves were shorter, but crowded with blueprints and architectural models. The faint scent of freshly cut pine lingered in the air. Adrian stood beside the desk, one hand resting lightly on a neatly stapled stack of documents. "I'm working on a new project," he said, eyes still on his laptop screen. "A community center and support platform for single parents, temporary housing, legal aid, peer support. I want it to be truly useful." Clara frowned slightly. "I'm not sure. This is the kind of project I could help with. I don't have a degree, and I've never worked in this field." Adrian looked up, his gaze steady. "But you have experience. You know what it's like to be left behind. You understand what's missing out there. I don't want this designed from the perspective of an architect or a businessman. I want it from someone who's lived those gaps." Clara was quiet for a moment. All her life, people had only told her what to do: clean, serve, finish the task. No one had asked what she thought. No one had waited for her answer. The idea that someone like Adrian would want to hear her was both daunting and strangely warm. "All right," she said softly at last. "I'll try." In the days that followed, Adrian invited her to join the project's virtual meetings. At first, Clara simply listened, taking careful notes. But gradually she began to speak up, suggesting a simpler interface for older phones, reminding the team to design for people juggling a baby while using the app. Each time she spoke, the room paused to listen, nodding, jotting down her words. No one said, "That's not necessary," or "We already know." For the first time, Clara felt her voice carried weight. One evening, after a long session, Adrian walked into the side kitchen where she was rinsing glasses. "You did well today," he said, his voice lower than usual. Clara smiled without looking up. "I didn't think I'd enjoy anything tech-related, but I like the feeling of doing something that matters." He paused before replying, his tone measured. "I didn't think I'd trust anyone again, but I trust you now." The words made Clara lift her head. Their eyes met, not hurried, not loud, just a quiet acknowledgement that something had begun between them. That morning, the sky hung heavy and gray, a dusting of snow settling on the pines outside the window. Clara was folding laundry in the upstairs utility room when she heard the sound of an engine. Not the familiar rumble of Adrian's SUV or the soft purr of Mrs. Pennington's sedan. This was smoother, richer, like the sound of footsteps from someone who had always walked on carpet. She moved closer to the frost-clouded glass. A sleek black SUV rolled slowly into the driveway. The door opened and a woman stepped out, tall, slender, with soft blonde curls framing a well-structured face, a caramel leather coat falling neatly over her frame. Every step toward the stone steps carried the quiet confidence of someone who didn't need to learn how to belong. It felt to Clara like watching a fragment of the house's memory return. 10 minutes later, basket in hand, she was heading down the hall when she caught Adrian's voice from the study, lower, rougher than he ever used with her. Threaded through it was a softer female voice, weighted with shared years. Instinct made Clara pause. The study door was slightly ajar, a ribbon of warm light spilling into the hallway. She stood close to the wall, her eyes drifting toward the gap. Adrian stood near his desk, facing the woman she'd just seen arrive. In Lydia's arms was Ella, fast asleep, her face tucked against her mother's shoulder, breathing as if she'd never left that embrace. "I didn't come to cause trouble," Lydia said softly, her fingers brushing Ella's cheek. "I just missed her. And I missed you." Adrian was silent, his gaze leaving Lydia only to return. He took in a deep breath, and when he spoke, his voice was slow, weighted like it carried the winter in from outside. "Lydia, you left, and I learned to live without you. But seeing you here now, I don't know if I have it in me to push you away again." The words didn't just cut. They shattered something she'd thought was finally strong. The air seemed to thicken. Every heartbeat thudded hard against her ribs. All they'd shared, the meetings, the brief glances, the copy of Jane Eyre on her pillow, suddenly felt small, almost non-existent. She stepped back, then another step. The house was warm, but her palms were icy, trembling as she set the laundry basket down. A truth rang hollow in her chest. She was just an outsider. Even if Adrian had once trusted her, even if his gaze had lingered, his history was a room she'd never have the key to. Lydia didn't have to try to enter. She had once lived here, once slept in that bed, once given birth to Ella. And Clara? No degree, no family, no story that made anyone stop and choose her. Only her heart. And now that heart was closing itself before someone else could slam the door. When Clara left the hallway that day, the study door remained ajar, letting the rest of the conversation drift into the room. After the heavy pause, Adrian spoke again, his voice deeper. "But, Lydia, I've learned to live without you, and I don't want to go back to where we were. The only thing we will always share is Ella. I respect you for that, but what was between us is over." Lydia tightened her hold on Ella, nodding slightly. "I know. I didn't come to change the past. I just wanted to see her grow, even if it's from a distance." But Clara never heard those words. She had already turned away, carrying with her the version of the story she believed she had seen in full. That night, when the house had fallen into silence, Clara sat at the side kitchen table, a blank sheet in front of her. She wrote slowly, each word pulled from somewhere deep. "Thank you for letting me feel like I mattered, even if just for a moment. Ella is an angel. I wish you both the very best. No accusations, no explanations, just enough to say goodbye." She folded the note neatly, left it on the counter. Quietly, she returned to her room and packed her suitcase. When she stepped outside, the clock read just past 11 p.m. Snow was falling heavier now, blanketing the path. Clara didn't look back. She wheeled her suitcase across the yard, each crunch of the wheels in snow sounding like a line being erased. She left Stonehaven carrying all she had once hoped could be a beginning, now nothing more than a story she would never get to start. The overnight bus pulled away from Stonehaven, carrying Clara farther from the White Mountains and the looming stone estate. Outside, rows of streetlights slid past the window like strands of memory, blurred, long, and impossible to hold on to. She didn't know how long she'd slept. When she opened her eyes, the cool, gray-blue light of morning filtered through the glass. A sign on the roadside read, "Portland, Oregon, 15 miles. She had chosen the city for a strange reason. She'd once read about it in an old novel at the orphanage. A place with weekend art fairs, coffee shops steaming all year round, and odd souls living fully as themselves. Maybe here she could disappear, or begin again. Her rented room sat in the attic of an old wooden house in East Portland. Barely 200 square feet, low ceiling, tiny kitchen, but the skylight opened to a canopy of green leaves. Beneath the counter, she placed her wooden box, the baking tools she'd kept since she was 16. In those first days, she barely stepped outside. Morning coffee, reheated bread from the day before, evenings curled up with a book. But when her hands closed around the rolling pin, the familiar weight returned, the one thing in her life that had never betrayed her. One afternoon, Clara wandered into the streets and found herself stopping at a weekend market in Alberta Square. White canvas tents lined the walkway, vendors chatting with customers like old friends. The air was filled with the smell of roasting coffee, hot waffles, and the soft strum of a guitar from the street corner. She lingered at an embroidery stall, staring at a tablecloth whose fabric had yellowed with time, yet every stitch remained neat, still carrying the warmth of the hands that made it. That evening, back in her room, Clara opened her laptop and filled out a vendor application. She named her stall Flower and Grace. 3 weeks later, she set up a borrowed wooden table, arranged trays of handmade pastries, a few intricately decorated tarts, and a small box of cookies wrapped in parchment. Passers-by stopped, asked prices, commented on the smell. An elderly woman bought 2 strawberry tarts, saying, "You bake like someone from another time, something peaceful." It was Clara's first sale. Gradually, people returned, ordering cakes for special occasions, bringing in old confections for her to redecorate. It wasn't enough to make her wealthy, but it was enough to pay rent, enough so that every morning she had a reason to get out of bed. By her second month, Clara began therapy at a small clinic near the market. The first 2 sessions, she barely spoke. But in the third, when the therapist asked, "When was the last time you felt left behind?" she cried. From then on, she came every week, unraveling knots in her memory, the strange rooms of foster homes, the disappointed gaze of a former boss, the stone estate where she thought she'd found a place to belong. At night, she kept a journal, the pages filled with small things, a customer's smile after a bite, a batch of dough that rose perfectly, a morning that didn't start with heaviness in her chest. She still thought of Ella. She still remembered Adrian's eyes. But now they were no longer wounds, just old pages, warm to reread, but no longer pulling her under. The day she received her 50th order, a small wedding cake for a single mother, Clara stood still in her cramped kitchen. She didn't smile, didn't cry. She simply placed a hand over her heart and whispered, "Thank you." Time in Portland moved gently, as if the city itself understood that hearts once broken needed a slower rhythm to heal. When Clara left, Adrian didn't notice right away what had changed. In the first days, he kept to his routine, up early, checking emails, running virtual meetings, signing contracts. Stonehaven still stood tall among the pines, as quiet as ever. But the quiet began to feel different. It wasn't the kind he was used to. It thickened, turned cold. Ella cried more, her sobs stretching into the night. No fever, no teething, but every time he held her, she seemed to search for something he couldn't give. He tried lullabies, clumsy echoes of the ones Clara used to hum, but Ella only buried her face in his chest, falling silent for a moment before crying again. In the study, his mind would drift to the way Clara smiled when adjusting Mrs. Pennington's collar, how she set a coffee cup down with quiet care, or the way she murmured to Ella. These images didn't crash in, they seeped in, filling every pause in his day, making him lose focus. At first, Adrian was angry at Clara for leaving without a word, angry at himself for letting her go. But the anger didn't last. It gave way to a deeper emptiness, a new awareness that he'd always lived with a void, and Clara had been the first to show him it could be filled. One morning, after Ella fell asleep on his shoulder, Adrian sat at his desk and stared at the contracts waiting for his signature. The clauses, the figures, the obligations, all felt suddenly meaningless. He called the board, refusing proposals that would turn his community project into a cold commercial product. This app was built for people like Clara, he said plainly. If we can't understand them, we don't deserve to make it. When the meeting ended, the house felt quieter than ever. Even the fire seemed to burn without warmth. That night, as snow drifted past the window, he stood in the dark holding Ella's tiny mitten in his hand, one Clara had once mended with golden thread. And in that moment, he knew he wouldn't search for her to fill a void. He would search for her to tell her, face to face, that she was never meant to stand at the edge of his life. Portland greeted Adrian with the gold blaze of autumn leaves and a cold wind carrying the scent of roasting coffee from street cafes. He had only a few faint clues, an old email address Clara once used, and a remark from a project team member that she was somewhere in Oregon. He started with the weekend markets, where artisans sold food, crafts, and handmade goods. On the first day, he walked every row of tents, asking vendors and even customers. Most shook their heads, a few tried to remember, but weren't certain. On the second day, at a small corner market, he stopped at a stall of hand-painted art. When he described a woman with brown hair, gray-blue eyes, and handmade pastries, the young vendor smiled. "You're close," she said. "Go straight to the end, right next to the coffee and waffle stand." Adrian's heartbeat quickened as he passed the last stalls. And then he saw her. Clara sat behind a wooden table, wearing a cream sweater, her head bent as she carefully arranged tarts on a tray. The afternoon light cast a soft gold over her brown hair. He stopped a few steps away, his hands loose at his sides, feeling as if the entire journey, from Stonehaven to here, had been only to stand still in this moment. Clara looked up when she heard footsteps stop at her stall. Gray-blue eyes met a gaze she had once tried to erase from memory. "Adrian." She said his name, her voice steady but slowed, as if weighing each syllable. He didn't smile, just held that gaze, deep, tired. "I lost you," he said, the words rough, almost breaking. "And in losing you, I realized everything else I had meant nothing without you in it." Clara stayed still, her hand resting on the tray of pastries. "Rachel came back," she said quietly. "She has history with you. She has Ella. You belong there." He shook his head, stepping closer, but still keeping space between them. "Rachel thought we could fix things, but I know. What I need isn't the past. It's the present. It's you." Her brow tightened slightly. "I can't come back only to be broken again." Adrian swallowed, his tone not rushed but certain. "I didn't come to bring you back to what was. I came to ask if we can start over, in a new way. With you as my partner, the mother of Ella, and the woman I will never take for granted again." Silence lingered between them, the hum of market chatter filling the space. The afternoon breeze carried the scent of coffee and caramel sugar. Clara didn't say yes, she only drew a long breath. "I need time, not to run, but to be sure this choice comes from peace, not impulse." He nodded. "I'll wait." And they began again, not with a hurried embrace or a fiery promise, but with small steps. Weekend trips to the market, evenings playing with Ella, quiet sessions working on the new project. Slowly, the space between them filled, not with history, but with steady presence. 3 months had passed since they met again. Spring in Portland arrived as softly as steam from a cup, fresh green leaves on the trees, and mornings scented with freshly baked bread. Clara and Adrian didn't rush. They still went to weekend markets, still worked together on the community project, still took Ella to the park. There were no grand promises, just day by day, trust returning quietly but firmly. That morning the market was busier than usual. Clara was arranging pastries when Adrian appeared. He carried no flowers, no velvet box, only a small wooden box with a delicately carved wheat motif on its lid. He placed it in front of her and opened it. Inside was a slender silver ring set with a small gray-blue stone, the color of her eyes. Clara looked up. Adrian's gaze wasn't pleading or seeking pity. It held only the certainty of a man who knew where he stood and with whom he wanted to walk. "No diamonds, no display," he said, his voice steady, but threaded with emotion. "Just a promise, one that will last as long as I breathe, as long as you'll have me." The chatter of the market softened. A few people smiled, some discreetly took photos. Clara felt the heat rise behind her eyes. She didn't answer immediately. Her fingers brushed the ring, feeling the cool silver and the weight of its meaning. Finally, she looked up. "Yes?" Applause rippled through the row of stalls. Adrian took her hand and slid the ring onto her finger. They embraced, not with drama or fireworks, but with the quiet certainty of two people who had finally found their shared path. 3 years later, their small house in Portland was filled with morning light, the smell of coffee, and Ella's laughter. On the living room wall, sketches of Clara's new pastry designs hung beside Ella's playful drawings. Clara was now pregnant with their second child. Her bakery, Hearth and Grace, had become well known in the neighborhood. Regulars called her by name, asked about her health, and sometimes brought her special ingredients. Adrian still ran the single mother support app, now active in 10 countries. But every morning he made time to brew coffee for Clara and prepare breakfast for Ella before starting work. One morning, as they sat at the kitchen table eating waffles, Ella, now almost 4, looked up and asked, "Mommy, why do you smile when no one's talking?" Clara glanced at Adrian, then gently placed her hand over her belly. "Because I remember when I had nothing, and now I have everything." Adrian smiled, taking her hand in his. There were no grand promises left to make. This house, this family, was the answer.